Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining our event on disability rights, our civil rights, a conversation on inclusive democracy hosted by the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy and the Sillerman Center for the Advancement of Philanthropy at Brandeis University. My name is Monica Mitra, and I'm the director of the Lurie Institute. Democratic societies derive their policies, practices, and values from the people. But how can a democratic society be? How democratic can a society be if people experience systemic exclusion and marginalization? People with disabilities make up roughly a quarter of the US population. However, discussions of disability policy, advocacy, and civic engagement disproportionately focus on the perspectives and experiences of non-disabled people. People with disabilities are as committed to their communities as other people are, but they frequently encounter barriers to their participation, including discrimination, inaccessibility, social isolation, and systemic oppression. Disabled people who experience other kinds of marginalization, such as racism, casteism, or classism, are even more likely to encounter these roadblocks. If a society is truly for, by, and of the people, then we must include everyone. Inclusive democracy allows everyone to participate fully in the community, regardless of disability, gender, race, ethnicity, social class, or other characteristics. Focusing on civic engagement is particularly salient this year. The presidential election and the COVID-19 pandemic have underscored the need for civic engagement among disabled people, many of whom have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and the healthcare and social policies that value the lives of non-disabled people over those of their disabled counterparts. In 2019, we started working with the Ford Foundation on a report that interwove firsthand perspectives from disabled people to highlight the many difficulties that people with disabilities encounter. This past May, we released that report, Civic Engagement and People with Disabilities, a Way Forward Through Cross-Movement Building. When we interviewed people with disabilities for this report, one participant told us, "Come to where we are, the accessible spaces. We're glad to know that you are here this afternoon in our virtual accessible space to learn how civic engagement organizations, disability advocacy groups, philanthropists, and the general public can support people with disabilities in building an inclusive democracy." Before we begin this afternoon's event, I'd like to thank the Nancy Lurie Marks Foundation, the Sillerman family, and the Ford Foundation for their generous support. And without further ado, I'm thrilled and honored to introduce this afternoon's panel, Sandy Ho of the Lurie Institute, Claribel Vidal of the Ford Foundation, and Rebecca Cokley of the Center for American Progress. Claribel Vidal is a program associate on the Civic Engagement and Government team at the Ford Foundation, where she works with the grant-making team seeking to close the civic participation gap among historically marginalized communities. As a native New Yorker and a Latina raised in an immigrant household, she has encountered distinct challenges that have exposed her to the systemic inequalities prevalent in our society. And these life experiences have become motivating factors in her pursuit to contribute to social change. And we also have Rebecca Cokley, who is the director of the Disability Justice Initiative at the Center for American Progress, where her work focuses on disability policy. Most recently, she served as executive director on the National Council on Disability, and prior to that, she served in the Obama administration for 4 years. She has spent the last 15 years helping make stronger and deeper connections across civil rights communities and continues to see the importance of cross-movement movement solidarity. And Sandy Ho, who is the moderator of the event, is a research associate with the Lurie Institute for Disability Policy, as well as a community organizer focused on disability justice and intersectionality. Her areas of interest include public health priorities of people with disabilities from diverse racial, ethnic, and linguistic communities. She is also the founder of the Disability and Intersectionality Summit and is the lead author of our report. So a warm welcome to all of those who are attending, and of course to our fabulous speakers.
Thank you so much, Monica. And welcome everyone, and welcome to our two fabulous guests. So before we get into our conversation, I just have a few logistical things to mention. So you can access the report through the QR code that was in the banner page seen at the start of this event. Also, the link to the report itself is going to be in the chat. For our friends who might be following along through social media, this conversation is being live tweeted from the @Lurie Institute Twitter account. The hashtag that is being used for this conversation today is #InclusiveDemocracy. I also wanted to remind everyone that this event is being recorded, and also the Q&A chat box is open to our attendees. So please submit questions, which we will be addressing during the last 15 minutes of this program. So I wanted to begin by building upon that idea of an inclusive democracy that Dr. Mika had mentioned in her opening remarks. So I'd like to ask both of you today, what do you think is meant by inclusive democracy, and why is it important that people with disabilities are a part of leading this discussion on what an inclusive democracy looks like? So we want to start with Rebecca.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Cokley. Thanks to all our colleagues at Brandeis and the Lurie Center and everyone that did such phenomenal work to pull this together today. For those that can't see, and because we're all sitting down, I'm a little person. That helps sort of inform my experience in the space. Thinking about what makes an inclusive democracy really honestly even hits at that for me. My earliest experience voting, or in a situation where voting was happening, was going with my dad to the polls. And my dad was a wheelchair user and was also a little person. And I remember us going to go vote at a place that he was able to vote at before he used a chair. And now he couldn't vote there. And I remember them telling him, well, just have your daughter vote for you. And I was like 7. And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, just have your daughter come in, just tell her what you want to vote for and then have her come in. And he was like, no, that's not, she's 7. Like that's voter fraud. And just sort of being blown away that my dad, you always look at your parents. Well, a lot of people look at their parents as like their heroes. And like my dad was strong. My dad was a wheelchair user that still taught me how to ride a 2-wheeler. And watching him sit here and be told that he couldn't vote, or that he would have to vote in a way that was inappropriate or inaccessible to him, really sort of blew my mind. When I think about what an inclusive democracy is, it's really a democracy that not only meets everyone where they are, but also has the expectation that like participating in that democracy is something that we do. It's creating that expectation where it's more rare that somebody doesn't vote than that somebody does. It's the expectation that you do what you can in that society to maximize their ability to participate in all things, whether it be the census, whether it be voting, whether it be going and participating in your town hall or city council meetings, whether it be if you're a person with a disability, like actively running for office and like being supported, being encouraged, and that not being looked at as inspiration porn or an anomaly.
Claribel?
Before I start, I want to echo Rebecca's thanks to the visionaries of this event at the Lurie Institute and the Sillerman Center, and all the support that we've received from the Heller School to put this all together. And I think for me, I just want to start with this is such a timely conversation, right? We are 26 days away from the election, the presidential election. We are towards the tail end of a census year. We are living through the COVID-19 pandemic, through state-sanctioned violence on Black and disabled bodies. And so again, this is such an appropriate time for us to be in our homes, in our living rooms, reimagining and discussing what a democratic system that serves and empowers everyone looks like. So I just wanted to say that because I'm so excited that we're here having these conversations. And for me, in terms of what an inclusive democracy is about, it's more than just representation. Representation is definitely one of them, but it's about a democratic system that's accountable to all the people in its country. that promotes and fosters, like Rebecca said, full participation within those systems, and that views participation as a right and not a privilege that only certain people have access to. And one that allows folks to shape and influence policies that affect their lives, right? Oftentimes, if we look at our democratic system and the politicians and the folks that are making decisions on our bodies, they don't look like us. And that is not an inclusive democracy, right? And for us, it's also about like centering the voices of people with disabilities is important, and the voices of other folks from marginalized communities, because if we're going to rebuild a democracy that represents the will of the people, as a country, we're having a moment of reckoning. And as our nation's infrastructure has failed most of us through this pandemic, it must include the voices and leadership of those that are most impacted when democracy fails. And so for me, that's what an inclusive democracy looks like. And it's why we need to ensure that people with disabilities and other marginalized groups are at the center of shaping that.
Thank you, both of you. Yeah, I really like that both of you have touched upon ways that democracy is not just about our traditional political institutions, right? That it is about voting, but it is also about centering the communities that are being most impacted by the decisions our democracy is making. So with that in mind then, I'd like to ask Rebecca, in the context of COVID-19 and this pandemic, and the anti-racist and the Black Lives Matter movement as well, why is it important for disability rights to be contributing to these actions and ideas?
So, I mean, as Claribel pointed out, I think it's almost laughable, like the number of crises that we're dealing with at this moment. And it's almost like it's the most 2020 thing about 2020. We have a pandemic, we have social unrest, we have a recession, we have an election. For disabled people, actually for all people, healthcare is under attack. And you can't look at any of these problems in a silo. You have to sort of step back, or using a leadership phrase, like step out on the balcony and take a look at it as a whole, and try to wrap your hands around it, because it is more like a bowl of spaghetti than like a plate of waffles. Like everything is interconnected, everything is intertwined. I think given the time that we're in, there isn't a space or any one of these crises that does not disproportionately impact communities of color, and specifically Black and Brown communities, and within that, people with disabilities. And I come to that from sort of two opinions too. Like, part of it is the notion that nobody joins a movement because your life is perfect. If your life was perfect, you'd be sitting by your pool, eating bonbons, watching whatever it is that you want to watch, reading through that stack of books that we all have next to our bed, and watching reruns of whatever it is, whether it's Law and Order, Murder, She Wrote, or The Golden Girls. People come to movement work because of trauma. And I think one of the things that we also don't talk about in this space, especially in the time that we're in right now, is movement work itself is traumatizing. And so in each of these spaces, there are already people with disabilities that are predominantly not having their needs addressed, or not addressed well, and are not finding their issues centered. And at the same time, these movements and the circumstances behind them are birthing more disabled people. I mean, we know that there's over 200,000 people who have passed away from COVID, and 7 million people who've contracted the virus. And we still don't have a handle on how many of these people are now fitting into that category of long haulers, which are people with long-lasting disabilities. It's going to be the biggest disability population boom that our nation has seen in decades. People, we know that disabled people of color, disabled Black and Brown folks are disproportionately abused and murdered by law enforcement. And it's not just in that initial interaction, it's throughout the system as a whole. It's from initial engagement through the court system, through incarceration, through parole, through reentry. Like all of these systems are designed to oppress, abuse, and disable people. And until we're willing to like have that conversation, you know, being able to approach it in a nice little silo, just it's ineffective, and it's not going to get us the results that we need.
Absolutely, thank you. Claribel, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add to that?
No, I think that Rebecca summed it all up, and I'm looking at the chats and the chat, and also noticing this word around intersectionality, and I think it's going to be a common theme throughout our conversation. So just wanted to lift that up.
Thank you. So, Claribel, then from the perception of philanthropy and the field of grant making, which is so often centered around funding, I think that's one of the general and common perceptions that comes to mind when people think about philanthropy and foundations. So when it comes to this national movement and movement building work, and building in intersectionality, so what do you see is the role of philanthropy in this call for an inclusive democracy, and what are some ways that this has been actualized?
Sure. So I have to admit, I'm a little cautious in saying that philanthropy has a role in movement work, and in this call for an inclusive democracy, because we are very far removed from the work that's actually happening on the ground. And we also, and I don't want to boost our ego or inflate our role. And I also recognize that philanthropy has a complicated history and just also a complicated existence in the way that it obtains and maintains it's the money that we use to grant make, right? If you are, for example, a private foundation, like a private university, you are endowed, and that endowment is in the marketplace, in the system, right? That is profiting and benefits from maintaining the status quo. And I think there's just I just want to name that before I even go into the question, because I think it's very important. And I think it's important because one of the ingredients that I believe is important for funders to have when we are stepping into this funder role and resourcing and working in partnership with leaders is humility, right? We are not the ones doing the work. And for some, we are not, I myself, I'm not someone with a disability. So when it came to Ford joining the disability movement and resourcing it, we had a lot of learning to do. And so I think it's just important to sit with all that complexity and for us to know our lane and operate it within it. And so saying all of that, I think there are three roles that I feel like philanthropy can play. And one of them is resourcing. We can't take away that is what our job is to move the money, to do that redistribution of wealth. And some call it reparations, whatever language suits you, that is our main role. And it's not just resourcing any groups. I think it's very important to be intentional, especially if we're centering this conversation around shaping an inclusive democracy, that we are resourcing groups that are led and centering the leadership of people with disabilities and other marginalized groups. And I think it's important, the centering piece is important because oftentimes we tend, and I say we, just as a society, we tend to look at certain leaders and want to support those leaders. And what we all know is, as Rebecca mentioned, is that the work of social justice and an inclusive democracy has been happening for centuries. And that even though we're in a moment of reckoning, there's still so much work that needs to be done, regardless of what happens on November 3rd. And so being very intentional about working with groups who are creating a pipeline for leaders. And one of the things that I admire so much about Rebecca is not just the work that she's leading at CAP and in her community, but Rebecca's also very intentional about the people that she hires and the way that she supports their leadership, so that when she's off to the next organization, those leaders there's a pipeline, right, of people of color, women of color with disability who can step in and continue the work. And philanthropy needs to be very intentional about that and be in it for the long haul. And then the second is, I will say that philanthropy does have a vantage point because we are able to look at issues from a like panoramic view and be able to work specifically in our portfolio that we work on civic engagement in government, work with civil rights groups that are doing litigation and advocacy, work with movement folks that are organizing, educating the community on the ground. And through that vantage point, one of the things that we can do, and that on our team we often try to be very intentional about, is to do pattern spotting. Where are we seeing that there are some trends coming up, that there are some needs that need to be filled? And sometimes that's like you need to move money so that you can bridge that gap. Other times it's like, how can we create spaces where folks who are doing work that overlaps can be in community together? And not a forced marriage, but like just so that you maybe heard about X group, but you've never been in communication with them. Okay, how can we bridge and be the dot connectors in a way that's not forceful? And again, we recognize and we're operating in our own lane. And then the last thing that I think philanthropy needs to do more of, and at Ford, we're trying to be very intentional about it, especially this report was an opportunity for us to do that. And it's to educate and organize our funder colleagues, right? So that the burden is not on the groups on the ground to educate funders around the importance of this work, around what's happening, and for us to then be able to introduce organizations who may not have access to or may not have connections to other funders as well. And so those are some of the things I think that in addition to the money, because we do need to move that money, that we can do.
Rebecca, I look at you as not only a friend and mentor, but as one of the most powerful network weavers in our community too. So please, if you have thoughts to share on.
I think one of the things that Claribel hit on that I know has been particularly advantageous for the disability community as it relates to like Ford's ongoing investment in disability spaces has been the fact that frankly the disability community is really resource poor. We don't have stuff. And by stuff, I mean like I've had jobs where I've started and we haven't had printers. I've had jobs and we didn't have physical office spaces, which right now obviously matters less, but at the time it was a really big deal. One of the things that partnerships with philanthropy can do is provide access to venues. There have been times where I know the disability community has tried to partner on meetings with other organizations, and you call folks and it's almost like you're like selling Ginsu knives or like door-to-door encyclopedia subscriptions where they're like, oh yeah, no, bye-bye. But if you invite them to a meeting that's hosted at the Ford Foundation, everybody shows up. And they're showing up, they've got their sleeves rolled up and they want to work. And it's delightfully sneaky because you're also there to be like, hey, you have your sort of like pretty woman moment of being like, hey, I came to your door, I tried to help you, and you totally blew me off. But now we're here in space, so let's figure out how we can do the work. I think the other thing that has been really key that I've seen, particularly as it relates to the President's Inclusion Fund and the role that philanthropy has really played, crediting Robert Wood Johnson and Ford for this space, has also been the connecting with other foundations. And so in the work that I do at CAP, I come across a lot of foundations that may have never funded disability and may be interested, but feel really intimidated about sticking their toes in the water. And to be able to say, hey, you know what? I don't speak philanthropy. I can speak a bunch of different languages. It's not a language I'm fluent in right now. But I know who is. Let me connect you with my friend at Ford or my friend at RWJF who is participating with this great network that are meeting foundations where they are. and helping them figure out how to engage in the space. And it's actually giving them professional development, which I found to be really key in like building trust across those spaces. Because I think the thing that's important to remember is that for decades, the philanthropic world was not invested in disability, or not invested beyond what would be traditionally seen as like charity or like almost even alms work. But to see this emergence of investment, which I also don't think has happened in a silo. I don't think we would see this level of investment, frankly, if we didn't see the level of activism in our community, particularly around issues like healthcare and education. Like, disabled people are refusing to be quiet, and we're refusing to be ignored. And that's a historical, I mean, that's part of our history. But I think now, given new forms of media, people are paying attention to it in different ways. And so it's altered the power dynamics in a lot of these spaces in a way that I think is really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. So both of you touched on themes that came up in our report as well. And in talking with disability rights folks and also civic engagement organizations in putting this report together, I remember early on in reaching out to communities, it was almost really difficult for me to like try to decipher like, well, who's in which group, because in my mind, as somebody who's a disabled activist and member of the disability community, there really is never a difference between disability rights and civil rights. And I think both of you also mentioned the pipeline and building those networks. And from talking with whether it was somebody who was a disabled person in an executive director position at a disability rights organization, or somebody who's talking about her experiences interning as in the AAPD internship program. Like, these are all parts of the movement building that we are trying to do. And yeah, I appreciate that both of you brought those issues up. So hopefully for our audience members, this is not the first time they've heard the phrase that disability rights are civil rights. But often it can seem like an idea that is overlooked and really taken for granted. Clearly we have experienced this time that we are all living through, that there are sectors of our society that don't realize this connection until after the fact, until it is too late, until we've seen that, over 40% of the deaths from COVID are disabled people in institutions. And so a lot of people in our report shared that it is often people with disabilities who have the responsibility of pointing this out. And I know Claribel, talked about how it is philanthropy, part of philanthropy's role in not putting that burden on communities. So what do you see as some of the barriers that prevent this idea from being more prominent in the civil rights and philanthropic ecosystems where you work? What recommendations would you make to amplify this connection between disability rights and civil rights? So who wants to start?
I can start. I think the first thing to me that I always think about is the fact that when you ask even within the disability community, who are the fathers of the Americans with Disabilities Act? And they tell you all white men. They say Tom Harkin, Ted Kennedy, Lowell Weicker, Bob Dole, Steny Hoyer, Steve Bennett. Nobody ever says Congressman Major Owens, who was a personal friend and a mentor of mine. And it enrages me. It honestly, it's one of those things that, my husband will testify, it literally keeps me up at night. Congressman Owens was the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus. He was the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. So he was responsible for getting the civil rights communities and the finance folks on board the ADA. And it never would have happened if it wasn't for him. And yet his history and his contributions have pretty much almost been completely erased by the mainstream disability community, which is really sad to me, especially, it's sad to me in general. It's sad to me as somebody that knew him, but also as the mom of African-American disabled kids. The fact that when I asked them, like, who was responsible for the ADA, and they're like, Senator Harkin, Senator Kennedy. And I'm like, but you knew Major, like, you knew Congressman. and realizing that we have to do a lot of that reclamation of our history. Lifting up the voices of people like Anita Cameron, who is a longstanding ADAPT activist, whose leadership has been so critical on every fight that we've fought as a community. I think part of the challenge also is, frankly, there's a lot of ableism in other movements. And there's reason for that. I mean, when you have things like drapetomania or runaway slave syndrome as part of a community's history that actually pathologizes it and says that if slaves ran away, they were technically disabled, there is going to be a serious hesitancy towards affiliating with the community. When you see that, when you see how disability has been used to shame and to marginalize and to imprison and incarcerate people of color, there is a real hesitancy to identify in those spaces. One of the things that that I've seen that's been really powerful is, frankly, in sitting down with other leaders, being very open about how broad the definition of disability is. It's honestly, I think, one of the most powerful tools we have. Is people think that the ADA, people don't read the ADA. And so they assume there's like a checklist of 10 disabilities that count. And they assume that it doesn't include mental illness. They've never assumed that it includes eating disorders. They've never assumed that it includes substance misuse or chronic illnesses, things like migraines. I mean, people always assume for me that my dwarfism is my most disabling condition, when for me, it's a migraine. Like a migraine will knock me out for a week. My dwarfism just means I have to pay twice as much as the rest of y'all for clothes. And so actually like drawing that out for folks, because what I've found is when I've done that in civil rights spaces, someone's been like, yeah, I have depression, but I've never considered it a disability. And then I'm able to frame it as, okay, so does it impact your activities of daily living? Does it impact how you eat? What you eat, when you eat? Does it impact what you wear? Does it impact how you engage with your loved ones? And usually it's those three questions that if I pose it, people are like, well, of course it does. Yes, it totally does. Or I've been wearing the same sweats for 2 weeks during the pandemic. I've been eating off the same 3-pound bag of gummy bears. People see themselves as part of the community based on activities of daily living and not on stigma.
Claribel, yeah.
Sure. So yes to everything that Rebecca named, and I would lift up two pieces. One is that ableism, like racism, sexism, and all the other isms, is embedded in many of our cultures. And so there is this knowledge gap, right, that exists where these connections are not being made. One of the examples that Michelle Bishop from the National Disability Rights Network always brings up that just puts things into perspective for me is, she's like, I'm usually, when I am at a civil rights table convening, I'm usually the only one that is representing people with disabilities. So for us, the question is like, how do we make sure that one, she's at the table, and two, that she's not the only one at the table, right? So that these connections are being made. And lastly, and not just so that the connections can be made, but also so that the partnerships can be formed, right? And then I think the other thing I would say is that oftentimes, because we look at issues in such a siloed way, I think philanthropy is guilty of that. I think folks in the nonprofit sector also do it. Folks, if you're an issue, if you are focusing on racial justice, maybe you're not including reproductive justice and women's rights issues in those. So we all do it, and it's a chicken and an egg issue. We can say, philanthropy is to blame for some of that because of the way that we practice our funding. But one of being able to be in partnership with one another is so important, because one of the examples that Michelle brings up all the time is when we look at polling site closures, for example. Oftentimes, polling centers are closed and they are in predominantly Black and Brown communities. And oftentimes, the reason that's cited for closing those polling sites is that the sites are not ADA compliant or they're not accessible. But do we ever stop and say, okay, instead of closing them, what are you doing to make them accessible? And do we ever stop to think that not only are Black and brown folks now disenfranchised, but now people with disabilities are also disenfranchised because you're not making more accessible polling sites. You're just closing them and saying they're not working. And so I think that this bridge, and a lot of it has to do with relationship, and breaking down the stigma and the stereotypes that exist and the silos so that folks can be in relationship with one another and build that muscle of being able to make those connections. So and then plus one to everything that Rebecca said.
So definitely, higher ed, and as somebody who is a policy researcher too, totally guilty of the siloing as well. We always see the ways that, hopefully not always, but sometimes we'll see the ways that people are using data to compare oppressions, right? And that's not helping dismantling the system that the policy research is meant to address. So before I move on to the next question, though, I just wanted to acknowledge that we are paying attention to the comments in the chat, particularly around the access of this event. So to clarify, the social media hashtag live tweeting of this event is just another way to follow along with the conversation. It is not separate from the event, and it is not by any means meant to exclude folks from the conversation. It's just meant to be something that can support other folks to engage. And I think I already mentioned this before, but this webinar is being recorded and it will be made available later to help with further processing as well. So I just wanted to lift that up. So Rebecca, voting is one example of civic engagement, and it's something that has been emphasized over and over again, the importance, which cannot be understated, especially in one of the most important elections of our time coming in November. But in the disability community right now, how can we expand our thinking about voting rights, and why is it important that we make this connection to civil rights, which Claribel had alluded to in her answer just now?
Definitely. And I'm really glad that you asked that, and I'm glad that Claribel cited the example of what we saw, particularly in Atlanta, during the gubernatorial race where the Secretary of State closed polling places specifically in the African American community. We see this also happen a lot in the Native American community too. I was talking to some colleagues of mine that were talking about how polling sites on the res are being closed. And there might be one polling place within 100 miles for folks, and they're not able to get out there. Folks on the res don't always necessarily have mailboxes, and so they might have to go to, a post office that's 75 miles away to access their ballot. These are all things that the disability community should be so enraged about, because they're not even just because there are disabled people in all these places, because we know that there are, but because it's also just fundamentally wrong. I actually want to give a shout out. I saw that Dom Kelly is participating today, and Dom is a great example of somebody who, Dom works with Stacey Abrams's organization Fair Fight, and Dom is an activist with a disability. And I think that's also part of what we need to shift to doing too, is while it's so important that disabled people create organizations that work on disability issues, I also think it's equally, if not more important, that we really move to an infiltration agenda and think about where are the places that we need to be, and how, who are the right people to be there, and how do we plant those seeds in those places. And I think, Fair Fight's a really great example. Stacey Abrams is very open about being the family member of a person with a disability, and how their family and her brother's life has been impacted by his mental health disability. And thinking broadly about disability issues for her wasn't a reach. But for a lot of organizations, it is. And so thinking like, one of the things that I like to think through, I don't play fantasy football, like that's totally not my thing. But I love to sit there and think through, okay, here's like 20 progressive organizations. If I could have disability projects in these 20 organizations, where should they be? What should they be focused on? And who should be running them? Is one of the things that I also think about. And I also think that, in addition, as I said, to an infiltration agenda, something I think that holds us back in a lot of these spaces is, as a community, we don't have trade associations. Like, there is no national organization of disabled teachers. The only organization that I know of, and having done this work for over 20 years now, is the National Organization of Nurses with Disabilities. But in all these fights for inclusive classrooms, it would be amazing if there was a national coalition of disabled teachers. It would be amazing if we had a national organization of disabled engineers when it comes to like accessibility. If there was a national organization for disabled people in tech, when we're fighting for web accessibility, so that we could have the numbers and the power. And I think for us, we're so busy like fighting our fights because let's be real, we've had to fight our entire lives. And we've seen it with our previous generations as well. But to think about how do we join our fights with others in similar spaces, as well as on issue-based change, that's part of the civic engagement piece that I think a lot of times we're missing. We're thinking about the push to the polls or the push to a town hall meeting. And the last thing that I would say that I think is really important, and I think we've seen it this year, I don't think I've ever been more excited in my life than to see when Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley referred to herself as part of the ADA generation of Congress. We often talk about the ADA generation, the first generation of Americans with disabilities that were in school and K-12 education at the time that the ADA was passed. And having had conversations both with Congresswoman Pressley and Congresswoman Porter about their experiences being people with disabilities and the fact that their experience with disabilities is different than previous generations. And so it's changed what they expect in terms of how people with disabilities engage in activism and how people with disabilities engage in the civic process. And the fact that they see themselves as part of the community. I mean, I remember like 2 years ago, I was like, we got Tammy Duckworth and Congressman Langevin. We got 2. And then I was like, we got 2 more, we got 4, and I know there's way more than that, but it's also creating a climate where people feel comfortable disclosing.
Absolutely, yeah. I think that part of the barriers that sometimes is not talked about enough in civic engagement and voting efforts is changing the narrative of, like, do you belong at a polling place? Like, oftentimes, I have the privilege of being able to get to my polling place, and I have, the education to know that I have rights to access a polling place. But still, we come across, attitudes where people kind of, side-eye you and question whether or not you need help, or, as Rebecca mentioned, shared earlier at the start of this conversation, are just suggesting outright voter fraud in the form of quote-unquote accommodations. So, seeing the representation of leaders who are openly and proud of being disabled and being a part of our community, not just in the cultural identity, but also as a politicized identity too, that has been so powerful, and absolutely agree. I'm also just seeing the excitement from the chat of people, Becca, when you talked about the lack of trade associations, like the sparks just went off, and like that, to have that action come out from this conversation today, like that's already, like I'm already so proud of this conversation. So our report highlighted the need for cross-movement work. And I know that this is something that's been talked about again and again throughout all of our questions today, between the fields of philanthropy, civic engagement, organization, and also disability rights. And both of you have talked about examples of this type of collaboration. And but still, I think people are hesitant or are unsure about how to actually go about doing this. So why is this collaboration important to our collective goal for a more inclusive democracy? And Becca, you started off by talking about the strategizing of fantasy football style. But yeah, say more about that. Let's start with Claribel.
Sure, I'll start with an example that actually happened last year with a group of our partners in Texas. Last year, for some who may not have heard, the state Senate in Texas proposed a bill called SB 9 that would make it hard for Texans, especially BIPAC and disabled people, to vote. The bill proposed, for example, escalating the penalty for mistakes on voter registration forms from a Class B misdemeanor to a state jail felony. It would require anyone giving a ride to the polls to sign a sworn affidavit. So that would lead to delays and even in some cases probably just seem like too much of an hassle. And it would most likely discourage folks who were driving folks to the poll. And think about who may need a ride to the poll. Some folks with disability, some poor folks who may be catching a ride with a neighbor. So again, the intentionality around this very explicit voter suppression tactic. And then the bill threatened to make it hard for some people to vote by mail and for disabled voters to receive assistance. And what we noticed, what happened, and we supported our partners in this effort, was a group of Texas voting rights groups and organizing groups partnered with disability rights groups in Texas. And they launched a sick, dope campaign around to educate the public and literally ring the alarm. It was a media and public communication strategy, and it employed and added pressure to the politicians. And the bill, which was passed in the Senate, failed to reach the House floor. So to your question, Sandy, when I think about that example, to me, I think about this was last year where this attempt, where this, folks were coming together to scheme and to come up with another tactic to keep folks in Texas from voting. Imagine if that bill would have passed and we are in 2020 and we are having all of the concerns related to voting. The damage and the disenfranchisement that would have happened in Texas would have been worse than what we're probably anticipating. And so I look at that example and I think about what made that possible. It was that the Texas civil rights and voting groups were already in partnership with these disability groups. They already knew of each other. So when they saw this, they were like, they read right through it. And instead of this kind of tactic to pin one group against the other, they were like, no, this disenfranchises our community and yours as well. So we need to come together. And I mean, if you Google SB 9, just do a Google search, the media attention that this received was only possible because of everyone that was part of this effort. And I just think and dream, right, about very similar, Rebecca, to your point, what would it look like if organizations, especially legacy organizations, newer organizations, already had folks that can apply these very different lenses into the work that the organizations are doing. And so this true integration around what an inclusive democracy would look like. And so to me, when I think about that example, it was just it solidified for us the importance of why we needed to include disability rights and a disability lens in our existing grant making. And I just can't imagine what would have happened if that bill passed right now.
Rebecca?
At some point, I want to give a shout out. I saw that Alejandrina Guzman, who's a longtime disability rights activist in Texas, who was part of the crew working on this, is in the chat. One of the things that I think is really important is it's twofold, because it's also, I mean, I want to be really real. The disability community really struggles with racism. And we haven't talked about that, but it's something that our community really fundamentally has a problem around racism within our community, within the leadership of our community, creating opportunities for professional development for staff of color to move through the ranks, centering issues facing staff of color within our organizations. And so it's twofold. And I think part of it, one of the things that it really sucks, because like at the same time, you don't want to be a self-narrating zoo exhibit. Like you don't want to be the disabled person that's in like cross movement spaces, having to sit there and vent your spleen and tell all your trauma in such a way that your fellow activists can see something to connect with, and they're like, oh no, you are my peer. Like you're not the short bus. You're not the segregated classroom over there. You're like, we do have commonality of experience, and though the oppressions we face might be different, they both are equally messed up oppressions, and we have common enemies. But there is real power in talking about the strength of our community. And I had a friend who was an activist in immigration spaces, and we had one of those, I always call them like the 2 o'clock in the morning slumber party conversations, because they're like the only those conversations that you have with your friends after your parents have gone to bed, and you start like sharing like your deep-seated fears and things like that. And a friend of mine were sitting by a fire in Montana, actually, thanks to the Ford Foundation, last year, back when we could travel. And one of the things he said to me, he's like, I'm very out about the fact that I have been in AA for 20 years. He's like, but I'm not out about the fact that I have an anxiety disorder. And he's like, so I talk about my substance misuse within immigration spaces all the time because it's such an issue. I remember looking at him and being like, so you don't think anxiety is an issue in immigration spaces? And I tried to hold on, my incredulousness was pretty significant. And so I was like, that's really interesting. And I said, so what would happen if in your next big speech, and you're at your next big immigration rally, you talked about the fact that you live with anxiety? And he was like, I don't know. And I was like, all right, I'll buy you dinner. Like, do it, and I'll buy you dinner. And I want to hear how it goes. And it was during all the DACA fights, like the never-ending DACA fighting. And at his next rally, he talked about the fact that in addition to being somebody who is a proud chip-carrying member of AA, he's a person that lives with a mental health disability, and that it's really exacerbated in this time of uncertainty. And it was funny because he didn't realize I was there. It's the benefit of me being a little person. You can't tend to see me in a crowd. And when he came off the stage, quite literally at least 30 young people like flanked him. And we're all talking about how they thought they were the only one experiencing what he was experiencing. And so when we went to dinner, he's like, yeah, there were a couple of people. I was like, dude, it was like 30 people. I saw it. And he said he never thought about it as a unifying concept. He never thought that was something else, that was part of the armor that he could wear as a civil rights leader when he goes into these fights, that it actually makes him stronger. It makes him more relevant to his community. And it makes him more relevant as a leader to talk about these things. And so I think there's a real opportunity across movement spaces to think about how we communicate like disability as part of that civil rights. It's why, often especially in engaging with marginalized communities, special ed has always been talked about as a place, which frames it really deeply in a segregation mentality. Like that, your son or daughter has to go to special education for X services, versus your child has a disability. And because of their disability, they have certain civil rights protections. And these are the services that come with those civil rights protections that will help your child become successful, that will help your child learn. And framing it, like flipping the script on how we frame our existence and how we frame ownership of a disability identity, I find to be a really powerful tool in helping people, in helping meet people where they are and help encourage them to get to where they could be.
Thank you both for this. So I wanted to make sure that we get time to do questions, which there's been a ton of conversation happening in the chat, which is great. So in looking through the question, I think one that would be good to start off with, and this would be for Claribel. The person asked, thanks to Claribel for acknowledging the problematic history of philanthropy and the long journey of the Ford Foundation towards supporting disability rights organizations. What led the Ford Foundation to move in the direction of funding disability advocacy?
No, that's a great question. So I'll start by saying that it was the powers above me. So it was Ford's leadership that really decided that this needed to be part of it. And from my limited exposure to what led to that decision, my understanding is that it was this disability community that really called it out and said that people with that here we are, the Social Justice Foundation, funding racial justice, funding reproductive justice, and that we don't have a disability lens. And so recognizing that that was a gap, and recognizing that when the disability community brought this to us, that it was factual, it was true, it was missing. And that we had a lot to do, a lot to learn, and a lot to do so that we could do this in a meaningful way. I'll say that one of the things when our foundation started to think about this and work on disability, that there was a real honest conversation as a foundation wide around making sure that we weren't doing this in a way where disability became an add-on, that it was more that disability needed to be integrated in all of our program areas. It needed to be integrated in our immigration portfolio, in our reproductive justice, in our mass incarceration and criminalization portfolio, in our civic engagement, in our arts, in film, and also in our operations. So in everything that we were doing, we needed to, and I think if you know Ford, we don't kind of do things halfway. So and there's been internal trainings around disability. It's been a capacity building effort, not just from the program and the grant making, but also from every personnel and the operations and our HR practices and everything. And so, yeah, it's been a long journey, and we have so much more to do because there's a lot of work to do. But I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. The next question I'd like to go to is, what can we as disabled folks do to help break down the systemic barriers to participation in our democracy? Who wants to take that on? Rebecca?
You know, I think about, and I will get in trouble for this and I'll own it. I think about our history of activism around accessibility. I think about the fact that the Smithsonian has a chunk of sidewalk from one of the first curb cuts in Denver that disabled people literally took tools and axes and hatchets to until it broke. We don't have anything comparable in the voting and the democracy space. I mean, not that I'm actively encouraging it, especially not this year, because I think this year is a year where more than anything, it's really important that disabled people can do whatever they have to do to get their votes cast. Vote early, vote now, vote, if you can early vote in person and it's safe, go do that. If you are looking at your ballot like I am, it's actually in my minivan outside, it's filled out, but I need to drop it off. Make sure you get it in. But I would love someday to see a bunch of disabled people shut down a polling place. I would love to just see them be like, you know what? Forget this. We live in this community. We pay our taxes. We contribute. And why the heck is this polling place at this location where it's been for, in some cases, 30 plus years, and it's still inaccessible. That's ridiculous. I mean, I would love to see folks do something like that. You know, I think that continuing to hold our folks to the fire. I mean, one of the things that's like one of my happy moments of this last 2 years has been seeing 12 different presidential candidates write disability platforms or have disability priorities in their platforms. Like, that has never happened before. At the most, I mean, the earliest time we've ever had a disability platform released was President Obama released one December 2007 before the general election. At that same point last year, we had 10 platforms released. We were only waiting on Senator Sanders and Vice President Biden to release their platforms. And so that's significant change. And it didn't start off smoothly. You know, it started off with things like Senator Warren using the term special needs, and the community actively coming for her and saying, that's not okay, our needs aren't special. Like, can we help you? And literally, I wrote her a document with footnotes citing why special needs was the wrong language. And she called me to talk about the footnotes, which was quite intimidating. We saw 3 different candidates host Twitter chats because they understood that disabled seating at rallies really sucks most times. Most times, I call it the butt seats. Like, non-disabled people, you guys have the nosebleeds. Disabled people have the butt seats. We have the seats where we're stuck staring at everybody's butts for like 2 hours at a rally. And to see 3 candidates host Twitter chats, to watch folks hire disabled people in non-disability roles. So, you know, shout out to Mayor Buttigieg, who hired Emily Vorde to manage Advance for his husband. Advance is one of the most critical and most physically demanding jobs on any campaign. And to have a person with a disability in that job means that there was no event they could have hosted that could have been inaccessible. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to participate. She wouldn't be able to do her job. And it actually shifted how campaigns work. So I actually, like, I have a lot of hope as you know, as crappy as 2020 has been, for our community and the strength of our community. I've seen some really significant progress being made, and also being made in a way that shifts the dynamic where we're actually being looked at as the experts from a lot of these folks versus being seen as a charity photo op. You know, and I think it's happening across the board. Like, we're seeing that same shift with philanthropy. We're seeing some of those same shifts with some businesses. Airlines, I'm looking at you, you're still problematic. You know, but things are happening in a really positive way.
Claribel, anything to add?
Can you just repeat the question? Because I was just like taken aback by everything that Rebecca was saying. So I want to make sure I'm answering it.
Sure. The question was about, sorry, hang on, let me pull this up. It was about the ways that disabled people can break down the systemic barriers to be building an inclusive democracy, and ways that we can do this.
Okay, thank you. I think to the example, the example I gave around like how Ford got engaged with this work, it was members from the disability community calling it out and holding us accountable. And so I think it's like, and the example you gave, Rebecca, right, where you, with the Senator Warren, like holding folks accountable, and also being open to having the conversations around like, okay, this is missing, you know, this is where you messed up. Well, how can we build and how can we move together? And yeah, so I think it's just like that accountability for sure. And I don't think it's not a coincidence that when you're looking at everything that's happening right now and these movements, the BLM movement, the conversations around vote by mail, like people are talking about people with disabilities, and it's because people with disabilities are making sure that we're talking about it, right? So just holding us accountable. And thank you to Diane, who said, like, Claribel, you mentioned you're not disabled now, right? But so much can happen, and as they get older, that can change. So yeah, it's a two-way street.
Yeah, I think one of the most powerful quotes from the report was from somebody who said that, you know, we constantly have to remind folks that their people are also our people. And, you know, making sure that that is the truth that is taken away from this conversation, or every time civic engagement or civil rights is brought up, that was a really salient and powerful takeaway that I remember all these months later after writing up the report. So I'd like to, this is our last question for today. So your report says, and I quote, "To generate meaningful access to civic power for people with disabilities, disabled people need to be leaders in cross-movement building work." End quote. What are 3 to 4 best practices for achieving this goal?
I'll give you a few. I don't know if I can put, yes, definitely get to like 5, 6, 7. But what my initial reaction is, I think if we're talking to a couple of pieces, there needs to be a pipeline of leadership of people with disabilities, of marginalized folks. And I'll say it because, to Rebecca's point, it has not come up explicitly, but we need to be there. Like, people with disabilities that are Black and brown, that are Indigenous, also need to be part of that leadership pipeline, right? The work that needs to be done is going to take a long time, and we need to make sure that we're not just looking at 1 or 5 people, that there is like a whole next generation that's ready to continue the work and to take it to levels that we won't be able to take it to. Like we're seeing now in this moment of reckoning. From a philanthropic point of view, philanthropy needs to fully integrate a disability lens, and especially for funders who are funding intersectionally. If you're not considering and acknowledging that people with disabilities are part of a marginalized group, then you're not really funding intersectionally, right? And you're leaving a bunch of people out of this conversation. And I would say the third is, like, folks need to continue the learning and bridging that needs to happen through relationship building, through partnerships, like the example we talked about in Texas. And so those are 3 that come up for me.
Hey, it's Rebecca. I was speaking at a conference last week on marginalized communities who deal with, like, disproportionate numbers of sexual violence. And one of the things that a question was posed from a leader from South Texas, where she said, "Why is it whenever I'm at a conference on any topic," and she's like, "it's always the Indigenous folks, the trans folks, and the disabled folks that sort of like give each other the nod in the back of the room, because we know we're the only ones that are going to lift up each other's issues." And it's like, you know, we always grab lunch together because we know that, like, there's usually, like, if you have a conference of 100, like, your smallest numbers are typically your Indigenous folks, your trans folks, and your disabled folks. And the types of segregation that we have faced is so similar. The types of oppressions we face are so similar. And so, you know, that's one of the things I would talk about is, like, continue to think through, how do you really throw off the balance of power? It's not just looking at an attendance list for a meeting and saying, we have 30 people coming to this, so let's have, you know, 5 spots reserved for the following people or the following groups. It's instead saying, you know what, let's save 25 spots for folks from marginalized communities. And what does that actually look like? I mean, it's when you're a leader in a space, also, like, actively refusing to speak on all white panels. It's something that I do not speak on all white panels. I do not speak at all white conferences. I've actually, in the last month. I've had to check 4 national disability rights conferences who have asked me to be on panels, and I'm like, who else is on the panel? And they've told me, and I'm like, I'm sorry, I don't do all white panels. You know, I'm happy to expend the labor and help you find disabled people of color who should be speaking, but that's actually what your job is. And you should be doing your job. And the fact that you're not doing your job, you should actually feel bad about it, because you're perpetuating the inequities in our community. I'm Catholic, so I like to throw a little extra shame on things sometimes. You know, I'm like, you know, sort of like Game of Thrones, like shame, shame. But you should be doing better. And we as a community should be holding our community accountable in those spaces. You know, the other thing that I would say is that all issues are connected also. I'm wearing a button right now that says vote, that I was handed at an event. And the secret behind this button is it was handed to me by a disabled person who works in a sheltered workshop. And I wasn't gonna, you know, they handed me the button. They were handing them out to a bunch of people. And I took the button because it was really cool. I was like, oh, it says vote. That's awesome. And when I had a second, I was like, let me check out this group. Sheltered workshop, paying disabled workers sub-minimum wage. And I wear this button all the time as a reminder that here is a person with a disability that is putting out merchandise, encouraging people to participate in civic engagement. And they're still making, that workshop, their average wage was $1.15 a week. If you don't see the connection between these issues, then we can't start this conversation. And so it's also like understanding that we can't have the conversation on civic engagement of disabled people if our folks are still disproportionately paid less than minimum wage, if our folks are still in segregated work environments, if our folks are still targeted for any reason across any of their marginalizations. And so it's having that as a point of thought as we move forward.
Thank you, Rebecca, and Claribel for your comments. And I wanted to be, to the best of our ability, to stay true to our time. So in closing, though, you know, last week, our Heller community had the privilege of listening to Dr. Kianga Yamada-Taylor speak about her book, From #Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, which is a book that our Heller community has chosen to read for this year. And in her lecture, Dr. Taylor mentioned, and so I'm paraphrasing here, that people have been talking a lot about making a plan for voting on November 3rd. And yes, that is of utmost importance right now. However, she also raised the point that it's also important to make a plan for November 4th and the days after that. And so I just wanted to take this time to raise this excellent point from Dr. Taylor's lecture last week, and to bring this up to both our panelists and also to our audience members as well, to keep this in mind. The civic engagement is a practice, you know, that can be and should be done all year round. As both of our guests have spoken about today, the importance of building the pipeline, centering marginalized communities in movements and events, and ways that we can change the way systems and practices have been done in the past, and really integrating a intentional intersectional lens that includes disabled people. So I just want to take the time to, again, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. I know I learned more about civic engagement, disability, and inclusive democracy than I knew before, and I hope all of you did as well. And so one of the things, you know, I personally miss the most during these times is showing up in community with friends, colleagues, and allies. And so to our audience members who are watching, know that I personally really appreciate your being here with us today. Deaf and disabled fam, I miss all of you so much. I have nothing but thanks and deep appreciation for both of our guests, Rebecca and Claribel, for sharing their wisdom and power with us. Also, I wanted to extend my gratitude to Monica, director of the Lurie Institute, Susan Eaton, the director of the Sillerman Center for the Advancement of Philanthropy, and also the Nancy Lurie Marks Foundation. And of course, last but not least, this event would not be possible without the access provided by our 2 ASL interpreters today, Anna and Victoria, and also Savannah, our card provider.